Let's talk.
Giles Brown.
Captain de Havilland's Moth, tales of high adventure from the golden age of aviation. Perhaps the most iconic of light aircraft, the DH-60 Moth was the brainchild of Deftly de Havilland, and the emergence of the plane in 1925 marked the beginning of an important but often neglected bit of British social history. I'd like to say we're about to put that right because I'm joined by the author of Captain de Havilland's Moth, Alex Norman. Alex, good morning to you.
Hello, good morning.
Good to have you with us. I suppose we've all heard about the Moth, but just sort of put some context into who Captain de Havilland actually was, because he is a legend. De Havilland is one of the legendary British aviators, isn't it, and builders.
Yeah, that's true. He was the son of a Victorian clergyman who built his first airplane in 1910. And he went on to have success as a designer during the First World War. He designed arguably three of the greatest and most important airplanes of the First World War. Probably the greatest of them was an airplane called the DH-4. He didn't give names to all his airplanes. He didn't start giving names to his airplanes until after the war. But anyway, the DH-4 was a medium-range bomber, but it actually could go faster and climb higher and outmaneuver just about anything that Germans had to throw at it. So by the time he designed the Moth in 1925, he actually had under his belt a string of successes, firstly during the war, and then after the war, he just started designing light or medium transport airplanes. But the Moth was his attempt to do for the airplane really what Henry Ford had done for the motor car with the Model T. He wanted to bring aviation flying airplanes, to the common man, if you like. Of course, it didn't work out that way because, a Moth at 650 quid, roughly speaking, was out of range of most people. But having said that, as the 20s progressed, the economy after the war improved. It became within range of the well-to-do. And also there were a lot of flying clubs that were starting to open up at around this time, and they were subsidized by the government. So for £1 or a guinea an hour, you could go and rent one of these from a flying club. And so gradually there did begin to emerge this kind of this group of people who were able to access the airplane. And but I guess what was really most important about it was that suddenly you had something that was, an airplane that was really capable of doing, you could travel at 75 miles an hour over 300 miles without needing to stop for fuel. Well, this was something, remember, at this time, there was no such thing as, there were no airlines, or if there were, it was bucketing across the channel, freezing cold, no heaters, no entertainment. The entertainment was looking out the window. So this was completely uncharted territory. And suddenly you or I, or maybe not you or I, but maybe somebody, who'd got a good job in the insurance industry or the motor industry, these industries that were growing up at the time, could afford to rent one of these airplanes, learn to fly it. And then suddenly, well, there were no rules, you didn't have to fly, at a certain height. You didn't have to avoid anywhere. You just got in and you just get in and go. And so that's what people started to do. And people had these completely astonishing adventures. My favorite one is a guy called Aspie Engineer.
Right.
Aspie Engineer was an Indian, young Indian, and he and his mate R.N. Chawla they decided they were going to have a crack at the Aga Khan Trophy. Now, the Aga Khan Trophy was a prize, £500 for the first Indian national who could fly between Karachi and Croydon in under a month. Okay, in under a month. Solo. They had to do it solo on their own. So what Aspie did was he persuaded his dad to cash in his pension. I won't go into it in detail, but basically this was to fulfill a family prophecy, okay? So his dad cashes in his pension, buys the aeroplane, Aspie learns to fly it. According to the rules, he couldn't do it unless he was accompanied by somebody on the first leg. I'll explain why in a moment. So the two of them set off from Karachi. Well, they run out of maps when they get to Cairo. It's taken them a week or 10 days to get to Cairo. They've run out of maps. So they're now down to using a school atlas. So they use a school atlas to get them from Cairo to the south of France. In the south of France, they've got nothing at all. So they're just given a direction to go to Paris, and then from Paris to Calais, and from Calais to England. Well, you wouldn't be surprised to hear that they landed 80 miles north of Paris in a field in the middle of nowhere because they got lost on the way. And you wouldn't be surprised to hear that when they left this place in Belgium that they'd ended up, you wouldn't be surprised to hear that they ended up not in Croydon, but actually 80 miles north of Croydon in Thetford, having got lost over the North Sea. Anyway, they made it. Incredible. They made it. And then Aspie turns around and flies it back solo. And when he arrives back, he did the job perfectly. He got there. He wins the race. He wins the prize. And on the day that he arrives, he's not yet half a year past his 17th birthday. He's a schoolboy. He's a kid.
A 16-year-old has
17.
Well, yeah. Sorry. But his birthday, presumably. So when he sets off his 7th.
He's not yet half a year past his 17th.
Right.
So 14 years.
It doesn't matter. A sallow teen has flown from Karachi to Cairo, but so that's across modern Iran, etc., and all that. And Gaza, exactly. And then used a school atlas to get across the Mediterranean.
Indeed.
Good grief.
That's all he's got. Get him from Cairo back to Croydon.
And then presumably railway lines north or following road network? I mean,
he follows the Rhone River from the south of France up to Paris. But then when he gets somewhere near Paris, he sees the Eiffel Tower. They see the Eiffel Tower. But the weather's so bad that they lose sight of it.
They could have been in Blackpool, for goodness sake, but not know the difference, a large tower, but there you go. So this obviously, so one of the things about the DH60 then is it's strong, it's robust, it's not overcomplicated. If it's going to do that sort of mileage with a teenager in it, it's got to be, like the Ford is, the Model T. It's got to be a decent bit of kit that can keep going.
Indeed, yeah. It's reliable, it's simple, it's pretty basic, but it's robust. It can stand a bit of a hammering, but the great thing is it's because it's made largely of wood, it's easily repairable. Wood and cotton, that's what it is. Those wings are covered in what's called doped cotton, so linen, basically.
And this is the thing, of course, that's going to come in. I mean, I'm not going to leap ahead, but if you know your aviation, then the Mosquito, of course, the world's first stealth airplane, is made out of wood and linen, basically.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely right. So, but the great advantage of wood, it's got two huge advantages. One is you don't have this problem of fatigue. So it doesn't, you could do 1,000 loop-the-loops and it wouldn't put any strain on the structure, It doesn't fatigue and break like metal will. That's point number one. Point number two is it's very easy to repair. So you could be, in the jungles of Africa, You can be in the swamps of the Far East, and you can find somebody who's got basic tools who can repair you.
We mentioned, because this is a social, as well as an aviation history, it's a social history as well. And because now these days flying is like, okay, you get, it's like catching a bus. You and I can get on flights, and you could be in Malaga in 2.5 hours. I could be in London or Manchester in under 3 hours. But it's incredibly exciting, and it's part of this brave new world after the war. It's the jazz age has come along. I mean, in Germany, gliding clubs, aviation becomes a big thing because of restrictions. It's going to be gliding clubs, but aviation is the way of the future, in the way that jazz music is the way of the future, and everybody's having a great time.
Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah, I think the sort of the seminal moment, if you like, was in 1927, in May 1927, when Lindbergh suddenly appears in Europe, having flown solo across the Atlantic. Suddenly, people look up and they think, oh my God, somebody has just flown direct across the Atlantic and landed nonstop, having flown nonstop in Europe. Oh my God, the world has just changed. It is no longer the world that it was yesterday. We're now living in a world where this is possible. And suddenly you've got people beginning to think, well, if it's possible for one person, it's got to be possible for two. And if it's possible for two, then it's going to be possible for 20. And over the course of the next 20 years, you see developments that actually bring you to the world's first jet airliner, which was an airplane called the Comet, again designed by Geoffrey de Havilland. So he actually failed, if you like. You could argue that he failed to do the airplane what the Model T Ford had done for the car. It never really was a practical proposition for everybody, because A, they're expensive, B, they're time consuming, C, the weather is bad, it's unreliable, you can't predict. It's not until you get the Comet when suddenly mass air transport is available, and suddenly, in a way, the romance goes out of it, but the utility and the practicality comes into it.
Because this is the thing. There's a Robert Redford film, which I'm just remembering now, and that talks about barnstorming, because that took off in the States. And Redford gives a speech, and he goes, they're going to make the air like they make the motorways, and they're going to have rules up there, which you have to have eventually, because otherwise people, be heading towards London, and you'll be meeting the guy coming from Paris halfway across the channel, etc. So whilst sort of Spirit of St. Louis, the Lindbergh plane is widely fated, you're going to need some sort of regulation to otherwise, we're going to be fishing them out of the channel every 5 minutes.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, so that's exactly what happens gradually starting in the 1930s. You do start to get restrictions. You can't land anywhere. You have to fly at a certain height. You have to go round certain airfields. You're not allowed to enter airspace, without permission. Then the radio comes in. But in the early days, the days of the Moth itself, were no radios. There was no such thing as an air-to-ground radio. There was no such thing as a GPS. The maps that they had, even the aeronautical charts that you could actually get, were very basic. You had, weather forecasting didn't exist really. So you were completely, you just got in and you went. And if the weather got bad, well, you just either landed in a field or you carried on.
And there was also, we're talking about the image it had. I mean, it was supposed to be, within the range of it wasn't supposed to be for the select few, but this particular aircraft was it the Prince of Wales and his brother were both fans of it, and they, there was a sort of racy story behind that as well.
Yes. It became, to start with, the sort of a plaything for the rich.
Yeah.
And as you say, the Prince of Wales had one, his brother, the Duke of Gloucester, had one, and Beryl Markham, the great Beryl Markham, who in 1936 was the first woman to fly east to west solo across the Atlantic, an extraordinary feat. But anyway, she herself was a rather racy individual, and in fact had simultaneous affairs with the prince and his brother. Oh, yes. In Kenya, when they met in Kenya, she took up initially with the Duke of Gloucester, but managed to find time to spend the occasional evening with his brother, the Prince of Wales.
Must have been something in the Happy Valley Water then that kept them going like that. Let's move swiftly onwards for the thing of decency on this one, shall we? I'm just thinking about we talk about the flying from east to west. Are air races becoming a thing at this point? Because I know in the 30s they're big news. Presumably a plane like this, although it may not be cute, is it the sort of thing you could bring to a competition? Because obviously things like, what is it, the submarine Spitfire develops from some of the air races, isn't it? So these are big things as well.
That's right. I mean, you had the Schneider Trophy
That's
races,
the one. Yeah,
which is what the Spitfire emerges out of. But you had other races like the King's Cup air race, which was a handicap race. So yes, in your Moth, you could, as Joe Bloggs, you could enter the air race and have a decent chance of winning. And there was, the Moth was, 1 year it came first, second, third, fourth, and fifth on handicap. It opened up the whole sort of competitive scene to anybody with the time and a bit of money.
We all know the name de Havilland, but what was the man himself like? I mean, was he eccentric? Was he bookish, the son of a clergyman? Was he a tinkerer? Was he in a workshop somewhere? Or did he enjoy, was he sort of le patron and saying, please take my aircraft and cheering from the sidelines or from the air traffic control tower, however you want to call it?
No, it's a very good question. What sort of a man was he? Well, I think the answer is he was one of those very unusual men who he didn't seek the limelight for himself. He was modest. He was unassuming. He had a sense of humor. But what he was really interested in was designing and building airplanes. And that's what he did for his whole life. And I would say that, modest, unassuming, dedicated. I think that's the word that I would use. Not in it for himself. He wasn't particularly rich when he died. He was an unsung hero, I would say, of the 20th century. Because if you think about it, 1910, he flew his own designed an airplane of his own design. Very simple, very basic. By the end of his life, he designed the Comet. He designed the first business jet, a thing that became called the Hawker Siddeley 125. So he'd really gone from A to Z in aviation. And yet, although his name will forever be associated with flying, he himself is one of the quiet men of history, I'd say.
Have you? I mean, are there any still sort of flying? I mean, presumably, is there? I mean, yeah.
Indeed, I have myself flown several hundred hours in the Tiger Moth, which was a development of the DH-60 Moth, and was the great training aeroplane of the Second World War. So I've had the privilege and fun of quite a lot of aviation in these great old, superb, practical, fun flying machines.
Is it? I mean, in a world, as I say, in a world where everything is now sort of fly-by-wire, it'll be AO controlled next, but the whole thing and flying is almost a sort of soporific experience. Is getting into a Tiger Moth development, is that really sort of open your eyes and no creature comforts and getting back to the real spirit? And it must be, on the one hand, it must be, well, actually on both hands, it must be exhilarating in both with the adrenaline rush, but also because this is a veritable aircraft, a venerable aircraft, and so you have to treat it with some respect.
Well, you need to treat it with respect, not so much because it's old or anything like that, but simply because they're quite, Well, I would say they're moderately demanding to fly. I mean, if you get it wrong, it's quite forgiving, but at the same time, it will bite you on the backside if you're sloppy and you're flying. But in terms of exhilaration, in terms of, the sheer phenomenology, if you want to use that word, the sheer sort of sensory experience of being exposed to the wind and the sound of the engine, and as you say, no creature comforts. There's nothing to beat it. There is nothing to beat it on Earth. And what's wonderful is you get in these things, and I had the extraordinary experience not very long ago of flying in my grandfather's own 1929 King's Cup air race entry, which was a DH-60 Moth, which is owned by a friend of mine. You're sitting in this thing and you're saying, well, why isn't it 1930 anymore? I mean, there's nothing to tell you that it isn't. The sky above is the same, the grass below is the same. Everything that you're surrounded by is exactly as it was in 1930. It's a time machine. You're in a time machine. And it is an amazing, extraordinary experience.
I'm just in awe of the people who fly these long distances, because as you said, it's a full-on experience. The wind, you're trying to read a map or, your school atlas or whatever, and and at the same time keep the thing level in all sorts of weather. And it's not a sort of macho thing either, because there's a typist from Hull. And when I looked at this again and went, she did what? So, Alex, please explain this incredible story, because this really is, if you think it's a boys' club, then listen up.
No. There were so many women who had these extraordinary adventures. And I suppose the typist from Hull, a.k.a. Amy Johnson, is the one that most people know about. And yes, she flew from Croydon to Darwin and then on to Sydney in Australia in 1930. And she did all her own maintenance along the way. She found her way from Croydon to Sydney, crossing the Middle East, crossing the Far East. Again, with minimal, very minimal support, very basic maps. It was an extraordinary story. And yet, she wasn't the only one. There was Lady Bailey. Lady Bailey flew from London. Her husband was a wealthy landowner and mining magnate, if you want. But give her due. She bought one of these airplanes and she said, well, I'm going to go and join him in South Africa. So she flies her airplane down to Cape Town, again, getting lost on the way and having to stop and ask for directions and running out of fuel and having to go by horseback to the nearest village to be able to, find somebody who can bring her some fuel. And she gets down to Cape Town and, then she decides to come back again. So she flies all the way down the east coast of Africa and all the way back the west coast of Africa. And then there was another couple, Violette and Jacques de Sabour, their name was. They decided that they would go around the world in theirs, and so they did. Absolutely extraordinary.
I mean, are there airfields? Are they just looking for something soft to land on? Because, Cherie, we should go around the world. And it's like, okay, fine. Fine. But because you can only do a certain amount of hours a day and then you've got to land somewhere. And are you going to telegram them in advance and say, we're coming, or do you just rock up and say, hello, bonjour?
Yeah, basically rock up. Sometimes you landed in a field. Sometimes you put your airplane, you folded its wings and put it in a barn. Yes, it did have folding wings. So people would put it in the barn for the night and drag it out the next morning. So sometimes you'd land in a field. Sometimes you'd land in somebody's stately home. Sometimes you land on the beach. Sometimes you landed at an airfield.
Yeah.
It was, these were pioneering days.
But you see, if you did land on somebody's stately home or on a beach, then people would be amazed by this. I mean, if today a Cessna was to land outside, because we've got quite a large car park here, and you go, oh, for goodness sake, you know, what's that El Herbert doing, as we say in Spain? However, back in the 20s, if you happen to pop it on Lord Frothingham estate, he would probably say, oh, you know, are you one of the, you know, et cetera, come in, you know, you must stay the night.
Exactly. I think that's a lot of that went on. It was your sort of passport, if you liked, into high society. And I think some people did use it as that. You know, it was, because it demanded a certain amount of skill as well as a certain amount of money. It was a fairly exclusive club, and it attracted a certain sort of person. So you might not be very rich, but you had the right stuff, if you like, and you were welcomed into, the upper echelons of society, if you like.
What are you hoping that people are going to learn from your book, Captain de Havilland's Moth?
That flying is fun. And more people should do it. More people should go out in vintage aeroplanes if they can possibly get the chance and experience what it was like in those days in the 20s and 30s when flying was, when the romance was still there. When you go in an airliner today, you're up at 30,000, 60,000, anywhere between 30 and 60,000 feet, and you're looking at some, computer screen, you might just as well, as you say, be on a bus or just, I don't know, sitting in a container or something, whilst the time goes by. No, try and get out there. If you ever get the opportunity to fly in an open cockpit aeroplane, I guarantee you will have the most fun that you can legally have with your clothes on.
And on that, I think we should leave it after quite a two racy stories. The book is called Captain de Havilland's Moth. It's by Alex Norman. You can order it via our own virtual bookstore. Alex, if people want to find you online, is there a website? Do you do the social media thing?
Yes, alexandernorman.com. No, wrong. alexandernorman.co.uk.
We get there in the end. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you, Alexander Norman. Thank you so much for your time today.
All the best. Thanks very much.